Dear students, today we are going to begin from page number 128 from the section Postcolonial Reading. In this section, Peter Barry talks about the first characteristic feature of postcolonial criticism. And what is that? The first characteristic feature is an awareness of representations of non-European as the exotic or immoral other. To arrive at this characteristic feature or to explain this characteristic feature, he is giving us a reading of W.B. Yeats' poems, Byzantium and Sailing to Byzantium. And he connects it with what Edward Said had told about Orientalism in his text, Orientalism, and also what Frantz Fanon talks about cultural resistance. Let us see what is there in this section. Reading literature with the perspective of Orientalism in mind would make us, for instance, critically aware of how Yeats in his two Byzantium poems, Sailing to Byzantium 1927 and Byzantium 1932, provides an image of Istanbul, the eastern capital of the former Roman Empire, which is identified with torpor, sensuality, and exotic mysticism. So, who is W.B. Yeats? It's given there in your notes. Note number 2. William Butler Yeats, 1865 to 1939. William Butler Yeats, W.B. Yeats, is an Irish poet who was also associated with the Irish national movement, one of the prominent figures of anti-colonial or anti-British upsurge, best known for his poetic collections like A Vision, Michael Roberts and the Dancer, and collected poems. So W.B. Yeats was an Irish modernist poet. And here Peter Barry makes a reference to two of his poems. One is Sailing to Byzantium, published in 1927, and the other is Byzantium, published in 1932. These two poems provides an image of Istanbul. What do you understand by the term Istanbul? Istanbul is an old city that reflects cultural influences of the many empires that once ruled it. It is an old city in Turkey, Istanbul. So it is a city in the east. And there is a reference to, or there is a description of this Istanbul in W.B. Yeats' two poems, Sailing to Byzantium and Byzantium. W.B. Yeats belongs to Europe. He is an Irish poet. So earlier we have already discussed how the Orient is getting represented in the psyche of the Westerners, either as the exotic creatures or as the dull, immoral other. And here, when we read W.B. Yeats' poems about the Istanbul, we get this idea of Orientalism put forward by Edward Said as apt to the poetry of W.B. Yeats. He says, reading literature with the perspective of Orientalism in mind would make us, for instance, critically aware of how Yeats in his two Byzantium poems provides an image of Istanbul, the eastern capital of the former Roman Empire. which is identified with torpor, sensuality, and exotic mysticism. And what do you understand by all these qualities? Torpor, page number 134 in your glossary. Torpor means lethargic dullness, indifference, and apathy. Exotic we have already understood, the strange or unusual due to foreign origin. So Istanbul is getting described as lethargic, sensual, and exotic in the writings of W.B. Yeats. At such moments, Yeats adopts an ethnocentric or Eurocentric perspective, seeing the East as an exotic other, which becomes the contrasting foil to his own pursuits and concerns, all of which the poem presents as normative. W.B. Yeats, he is an Irish national poet who voices for the freedom of Ireland. But unknowingly, when he portrays or describes a city from the East, there is a tendency in his writings to describe that city with exoticism or dullness. So this is what Edward Said talks to us about Orientalism, and this is what we see exactly in the reading of W.B. Yeats' poems also. Interestingly, Edward Said has written an essay on Yeats which reads him in the context of postcolonialism, reprinted in Said's Culture and Imperialism. Said views the desire frequently expressed in Yeats' work to regain contact with an earlier mythical nationalistic Ireland as typical of writers whose own position is postcolonial. And this is closely related to Fanon's idea of the need to reclaim the past. So here Edward Said make us conscious of a paradox in the writings of W.B. Yeats. What is it? Interestingly, Edward Said has written an essay on Yeats, and that essay reads him in the context of postcolonialism. And in that essay, Edward Said talks about Yeats as a person interested to regain the nationalistic Ireland. So what is it? Said views the desire frequently expressed in Yeats' work to regain contact with an earlier mythical nationalistic Ireland. So W.B. Yeats is a person who wishes for the freedom and liberty of Ireland from the clutches of the colonial powers. So he voices for the nationalism of Ireland. But when he portrays one of the cities in the East, that is Istanbul, he forgets about the nationalistic feeling or the indigenous identity of that city, and he tends to portray that city with either dullness or the exoticism which Said relates to in his Orientalism. And here he says, Yeats tries to regain contact with an earlier mythical nationalistic Ireland as typical of writers whose own position is postcolonial. And this is closely related to Fanon's idea of the need to reclaim the past. So the post-colonial writers in general, they voice for the nationalistic past of a nation, of a colony. And likewise, W.B. Yeats is also talking about regaining the past glory of Ireland. And this idea is closely related to what we have already seen as Frantz Fanon talks about, that is, to reclaim the past. Characteristically, post-colonial writers evoke or create a pre-colonial version of their own nation, rejecting the modern and the contemporary, which is tainted with the colonial status of their countries. So this is what the post-colonial writers are doing. They evoke or create a pre-colonial version of their own nation. Before colonialism, how were their nation? What all were the characteristics of their nation? They are trying to reclaim it, rejecting what the modern and the contemporary, which is tainted with, which is always polluted with the colonial status of their countries. The modern scenario or the modern or the contemporary status of a colony is the one which is affected by or influenced by colonialism. So, just reinstating that status won't do for the post-colonial reading. The post-colonial writers, they are searching back before colonialism, searching back, and they are finding out that particular status of their country before colonialism, and they are trying to bring it back. That is what Frantz Fanon had already told about reclaiming their past. Here then is the first characteristic feature of post-colonial criticism, an awareness of representations of the non-European as the exotic or immoral other. So this paragraph concludes with the first characteristic of post-colonial criticism. And what is it? Be aware of representations of the non-European or the East, or the identity of the countries other than the European as the exotic or immoral other. So with this, I conclude this session. I will be continuing in the next session. Thank you.